started. All right. So on that note, hello everybody. One more time. Hello everybody. My name is Janelle Ware. I am the horticulture educator serving with Extension, serving Marathon and Wood counties. And tonight I am going to share with you a program, Heirloom Biographies. And so I'm going to share a handful of some heirloom stories, the backstories of some real popular and maybe not so popular uh, heirloom vegetables. And then to finish up, I'll talk a little bit about some terms that get tossed around a lot. And I want to make sure we're all walking away with the same definitions. So I'll go into what does it mean to be an heirloom vegetable, and how is that different than open pollinated? And then I'll talk about hybrids, and we'll finish up with GMOs. What is a GMO and how is that different from a hybrid? All right, so we're going to start off with A.W. Livingston, but before I jump too far into his story is he is known as the father of the modern tomato. But before we get into him, we need to back up a little bit and just know a little bit about tomatoes in general. And tomatoes, their history on this continent and really the world. So first of all, tomatoes are native to both the North and South American continents, but they were only cultivated in Mexico and Central America. They were first introduced to what is now the US by the Spanish in Florida and New Orleans. And then slowly over time, it's made its way into the interior of what is now the United States. So all the way into the 1930s, there were still pockets of people in the northern portion of what is now the United States that still thought that tomatoes were poisonous. And this includes northern Ohio, okay, just to kind of set the stage. So even after people became familiar and understood that tomatoes weren't poisonous, most people still didn't care for either the look or the smell or the flavor of tomatoes. Joseph T. Buckingham, who was the editor of the Boston Courier, called tomatoes the mere fungus of an offensive plant, which one cannot touch without an immediate application of soap and water with an infusion of perfume to sweeten the hand. Oh, tomatoes, the twin brothers to soured and putrescent potato balls, deliver us. Oh, ye caterers of luxuries, ye gods and goddesses of the science of cookery, deliver us from tomatoes. So people had pretty passionate attitudes regarding tomatoes up into the 1830s. So in 1834, Dr. John Bennett published an article that basically said tomatoes were a cure-all. And I thought this was interesting when I did this research, because you think in these days, there's constantly a new superfood that's out and people are writing up articles and scientific papers on it and how, you eat this and this is going to be the, thing for good health and it cures all sorts of things, right? Lots of different things come to mind, right now. Well, back then they had the same superfood crazes. And so in 1934, Dr. Bennett writes this cure-all. And next thing you know, out there on the market in 1837, Dr. Miles is selling his compound extract of tomato. So these pills were advertised to cure indigestion, headaches, fevers, ulcers, hepatitis, complaints of the liver and congestions. And they even suggested these pills for children that would cure summer complaint, whooping cough, and measles, along with lots of other diseases. So this was in 1837, okay? By the time we get into the early 1840s, the tomato cures were reported as hoaxes. People understood, people are taking these pills and they still are getting, they're still dealing with some of the same issues that they were dealing with before. However, because tomato mania took off with such a fervor, that tomatoes really expanded in the culinary markets. And so much so that tomatoes were canned and then used by camp cooks during the Civil War. And because the camp cooks were making such use of these canned tomatoes, the canning industry exponentially expanded after the Civil War. So up to this point, tomato varieties hadn't really improved that much. So beginning in 1848, A.W. Livingston started tinkering in his garden as he was trying to improve tomato varieties. Slowly over time, it took a while, slowly over time, through plant selection, he was able to cultivate Livingston's Paragon. So then Paragon was the first tomato that he released. Now with the Paragon, he, let me get his quote. So he said that, and this is his quote, he said that it was the first perfectly and uniformly smooth tomato ever introduced to the American public, or so as I have ever learned, the first introduced to the world. And it would soon become a favorite for both market growers and canners. Okay, so if anybody is a genealogy nerd like me, you'll recognize this is a family tree, except for I made a family tree for the Rutgers tomato. So you can see it starts off with the Paragon tomato up here in 1870. Remember, I said he started working on developing the Paragon in 1848. So it took him a long time for him to finally get a tomato that he felt like, first of all, the genetics were stable. And second of all, it was to the point of his liking that he wanted to go ahead and put it out on the market. From there, he bred the Beauty in 1886, Favorite in 1883 to get the New Stone. And then he combined that with Henderson's Ponderosa to get the Globe. Globe was then bred with the Marvel, which was a popular French variety at that time. And that brought them to the Mariglobe. And this JTD, Campbell's soup variety over here, this story was kind of interesting. So this JTD, if I remember the story correctly, he actually was responsible for getting the Campbell Company into the condensed soup business. He was really instrumental in that. And so because of that, Campbell's was doing their own research and development in market ready tomatoes that would withstand shipping to the cannery. And so when they developed this particular tomato, they named it after the gentleman whose name is escaping me right now, but that's what the JTD stands for. Though that would be bred with the Mariglobe and would eventually lead us to the Rutgers in 1934. The reason why this is so interesting is that Rutgers, by the time, so that was developed by Rutgers University at their research station. So Rutgers, so it was that 1934, so about 20 years later, a little under 20 years later, in 1952, it would represent 72% of all commercially grown tomatoes in the United States. So it just goes to show, you know, the thing that I might take away, what I thought about when I was reading all of this is, wow, you know, A.W. Livingston really changed the way that, you know, we eat as Americans, right? It changed how we eat. I just think, like, would pizzerias be a thing if we didn't have, you know, A.W. Livingston really changing and encouraging people to add tomatoes to their diets if there wasn't something that was improved that people would want to eat. So getting back to Livingston, he would continue to develop those tomatoes, and his company would eventually develop a total of 31 varieties. He constantly worked to develop a tomato that would both ship well, have nice thick skins, and also have uniform roundness and flavor. When he died on November 11th, 1898, the Elmer Times gave a tribute saying that he would never be forgotten in the scientific agricultural world as the creator of the modern type of large, smooth tomatoes, which supersede the repulsive, twisted tomates of our grandfather's time. His sons would continue to develop tomatoes under the company name, and that is what would bring us the Rutgers tomato. All right, so we're going to switch gears away from, well, not away from tomatoes. We're still going to talk about tomatoes, but we're going to switch gears a little bit to Sheboygan. Oh, fun. So we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Sheboygan and the Dr. Jeff Nicola. So as I was researching different seed stories, Dr. Nicola's name kept popping up as the source of a lot of seeds that have been kind of taken back from, and these little pockets of these people that have been raising them, and so he finds them and then was sharing them with different seed banks. So the Sheboygan tomato in particular was grown in the Sheboygan area since the early 1900s. And it was actually Lithuanian immigrants that brought them to the Sheboygan area. And so these folks were growing them in the Sheboygan area generation after generation, making sure that they weren't cross-pollinated with any other tomatoes, taking really good care of them. And so eventually, I'm not sure how Dr. Nicola was introduced to the folks that were growing them, but he was able to share those seeds with the Seed Saver catalog in 1998. One thing I found about Dr. Nicola is he used to be professor, an ecology professor at UW Green Bay. And while he was at UW Green Bay, he started an heirloom plant sale in the spring where he would find these different heirloom plant seeds and then sell the starts of the plants at the plant sale. And then any of the proceeds from the plant sale would go towards funding research at UW Green Bay. He's now, the last information I was able to find about him, he's now a professor of ecology at the Czech Republic. But I'm not sure. I actually was in touch with Sarah over at the Seed Saver catalog, and I asked her if she knew how many different vegetable seeds or crops that he was able to not necessarily save, but secure their futures by sharing them with the Seed Saver Exchange. She didn't have a number, but I was able to find that. And garlic alone, he's contributed to at least 350 varieties of garlic. So if you think about how seed banks, and seed banks are just, you can think of them as organizations, collections of people that will take seeds and distribute them to these heirloom seeds, distribute them to other people that are interested in growing them. Because the more people save them and grow them, the better chance they're not going to become extinct. All it takes for these seed stories for these plants to no longer be out there is if you've got one family that's growing them or a handful of people that are growing them and something happens and they stop growing them for a few years, there goes all of the genetics of that crop, that particular cultivar. So it's really important, these seed banks that are sharing the seeds out. All right, next we've got Beaver Dam peppers. So a little bit about Beaver Dam peppers. If you've never grown them or tasted them, they're a favorite of mine. I love the color. The color is this beautiful candy apple red. Um, and the thing I like about them is they tend to be rather sweet. They're not really high on the Scoville units, but they've got a sweet heat that kind of builds up over time. So they're kind of a fun one to throw inside salsas and things like that. Um, Okay, so Joe, and apologize if I'm getting these names incorrect. Joe Hussely was a Hungarian immigrant, and he brought this pepper with him when he emigrated to the Beaver Dam area in 1912. And locals and descendants of friends of the Hussely family like to say that the Hussleys planted the seeds, grew the peppers, and shared the seeds with friends and neighbors, setting up a little community of Beaver Dam pepper growers who appreciated the delicious plant's mild bite enough to pass the seed down for generations. So Joe, when I was researching about this, I found that Joe is often credited for bringing the Beaver Dam pepper over, but I found that there was also another young lady who traveled from Hungary. She was a little bit later, so Joe got here in 1912. Anna Cisak um, arrived in 1920, also in the Beaver Dam area, and she brought some seeds with her as well. Now, I'm dying to know, I'd love to find out if they were indeed from the same region of Hungary, because it kind of seems like they were. Because they both brought over these pepper seeds, but I wasn't able to find that out for certain. But she brought some seeds over as well. And between the two of them and their community, they've really grown a following of people who love the Beaver Dam pepper and swear by it. So much so that there's now a pepper festival, the Beaver Dam Pepper Festival. Um, and it celebrates, it's your classic Wisconsin festival. So I was looking, I think, I was looking back at the 2019 festival, what all they had in there, and looked like a really fun activity to go to. So encourage anybody to go check it out if you're over in the Beaver Dam area. I want to say it's in either August or September. Okay, so this is one of my favorite stories. This one takes us out of Wisconsin a little bit, though. So now we're going to go over to, we're going to take a trip along the eastern seaboard. So we're going to start off. Fish peppers are believed to have originated in the Caribbean and traveled to the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Chesapeake Bay region. Folks think that, the food historians think that the fish peppers arrived with Haitians right around the time of the Haitian Revolution, and that would have put it around 1791 to 1804. So these peppers were cultivated by enslaved African Americans and freedmen. These peppers were used to ease joint pain, treat intestinal worms, deter bugs from crops, and then also to spice up bland diets. And I thought this was really interesting too. Enslaved people seeking freedom were known to rub the peppers on their feet to try to throw off their scent from bloodhounds that might be following them. On plantations, enslaved people could earn money and sometimes even earn their freedom by tending to vegetable patches and then selling the produce, things like fish peppers. I just took this picture because I just love the variegation in this plant. I mean, not only is the peppers themselves gorgeous, but the plants I think would make beautiful ornamental plants too. All right, so I remember how I just said that it would spice up a bland diet. So the way that these peppers start is, and I don't have a picture of it here, but before it's at this stage, when it's just kind of like a little nub of a pepper, and just starting to form and elongate. It's a real pretty creamy ivory color. It's all this color, this ivory that's in here. And then over time, the green striping comes in, and then that green striping, or not the green striping, but the that ivory color will slowly turn a real pretty orange color, and then the whole thing will ripen to a beautiful red color. Okay, so it's when it's at that kind of nub stage, when it isn't really fully elongated and it's all completely ivory, that's when they would use it in their stews. Because in the Chesapeake Bay area, your stews and cream-based soups and dishes were really, really popular. And if you throw in a red pepper in a cream-based dish, it's going to throw off that coloring, right? So with it being that ivory color, they could sneak it in the dishes, and it would be like that secret ingredient that nobody knew what it was. Okay, so fish peppers. Horace Pippin. Okay, our story is going to turn to Horace Pippin. He was this really famous African-American artist. He was from Westchester, Pennsylvania, and in World War I, he suffered an injury. And so because of that, a popular remedy in the 1940s was using bee stings for arthritis. Okay. And so he was looking for a source for bees so that way he could utilize the bees for stings for his arthritis treatment. And he befriended a man named Ralph Weaver. Ralph Weaver was Caucasian, he was white, and he had this real passion for rare plant varieties. And he had this huge kitchen garden, and he was constantly collecting different rare heirloom plants, although they wouldn't have been thought of as heirloom at that time, but he was just looking for anything that was unusual and different. Huge garden, and on top of that, he was a beekeeper. And so he traded Horace Pippin bees for seeds. It was a perfect match made in heaven. Well, Ralph Weaver stored his seeds inside of a chest freezer. Now, unfortunately, he passed away, and it was 10 years after his death that his grandson, William Royce Weaver, discovered this chest freezer at his grandparents' homestead, and looked inside of it, and he found all of these seeds that had been they'd been stored perfectly and they were viable. So he started growing these seeds, and in them he found the fish peppers. So in 1995, he offered these fish pepper seeds to the Seed Saver Exchange. Now, here's where the story really becomes inspiring and exciting. Since then, these peppers have regrown in popularity in the Chesapeake Bay area, especially with Black farmers who connect with the pepper's history. Um, oh, and in case you're interested in William Royce Weaver's story, he himself, so this is the grandson, he is becoming a very important seedsman in his own right, and he's also a food historian. And recommend checking out the book Heirloom Vegetable Gardening. It's got a lot of good information. If you're interested, if you like these seed stories, you may find that book to be a good resource. All right, now we've got Lorenzo Trussoni and the heirloom sawflower. So this story I'm taking straight from the Seed Saver Exchange. They were kind enough to share a couple of Wisconsin-specific stories with me. So this heirloom sawflower is from the Trussoni family of Vernon County, Wisconsin. Marilyn Loom grew it for at least 35 years before she shared the seeds with the Seed Saver Exchange in 2015. Her grandfather, Lorenzo Trussoni, left Italy in 1889 when he emigrated from Francisco in the Campodolcino region of northern Italy. He was in his early 20s and he left his home because there wasn't any work, which is a familiar story for a lot of our ancestors, right? He found employment in northern Wisconsin as a logger, and eventually he was able to save up enough money to buy a farm near Genoa, Wisconsin, where there was a lot of other Italian families. Marilyn's earliest memory of the safflower is having to go to the garden and pick it as a child. A nasty job as far as I was concerned, since the inner leaves surrounding the flower had hard barbs that really hurt. The dried safflower anthers are used in a risotto type dish that they call risotto. And it's prepared for the holidays. And it contains a long grain rice and cheddar cheese, because these things were probably easier for folks over here to get back then. Marilyn's mother made the risotto for holidays like Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas, as well as special occasions like weddings. Today, the safflower is grown not only by the Trussoni descendants, but by much of the Italian American community in and near Genoa. Marilyn says that the people in Genoa and the Genoa region hold it very dear as it's a link to Italy and relatives there. Part of our heritage we don't want to lose. I love that quote, and it makes me think about how food connects us so much to our culture. And it's also a way that it's our first point of entry into other people's cultures too. The St. Charles Borromeo Catholic Church in Genoa hosts an annual reunion picnic over the 4th of July, and risottos are made with the dried threads of this flower, are predominantly featured in every meal. And the dried flower petals are used as a saffron substitute. All right. Next, we've got so I live in Stevens Point, which is a kind of the potato. I think of it as the potato area of Wisconsin. So next up, we've got a interesting potato story. So this is the pica purple potato. This heirloom potato variety has been handed down within sandy pica Knapp's extended family in Canada. The family story goes that the potatoes were originally grown by John Pica Sr. in the early 1900s near Steuben, Wisconsin. So he decides he's going to go and move to Canada, and he takes some potatoes with him for the journey. And he ate most of them, but he still had some by the time he got to his destination in Canada. So he planted what he had left, and continued to grow the potatoes while he was raising his family. So he had a total of 6 sons. Of those 6 sons, one, Albert, continued to grow the potatoes and maintain that crop, his father's potatoes from Wisconsin. So let's see. Sandy and her husband, Don Knapp, have grown the potatoes near Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin since 2008, when they received their tubers from Sandy's relatives in Canada and were able to bring the potatoes home again to Wisconsin. And then the Knapps then shared the variety with the UW-Madison, which placed the potatoes in their tissue culture program to eradicate any viruses. And then from there, they shared them with the Seed Saver Exchange in 2019. So UW-Madison was the ones that took their seed potatoes that they knew were free of any viruses and shared them over with the Seed Saver Exchange. So a couple of thoughts for this. They're supposed to be really, really good in flavor. They've got kind of a creamy interior, creamy flesh to them. And the Heritage Farm, which is the Seed Saver Exchange farm that grows all of these crops every year. They said that in 2019? Yeah, 2019, it was one of their most productive varieties that they had. So to keep in mind. Just for a thought too, because it will make a difference. I'm pretty sure, I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure the Heritage Farm is either in Iowa or Minnesota. All right. So taking us out of the Midwest and over to northern New Mexico. So this is a story that I'm going to share a little bit with you about this one. This one's actually I'm bringing to the table. Chimayo is, well, first let me back up. Land race, because that was the big reason why I wanted to bring this up. So land race is a term you might hear if you are in either uh, heirloom vegetable circles, or oftentimes you'll hear it with livestock too. Okay, so land race it's a term that is used to describe domesticated, locally adapted, traditional varieties of a species of a plant or an animal that's developed over time through adaptation to its natural and cultural environment. But here's the thing, because of isolation from other populations, right? So you've got to be cultivating this in some sort of pocket someplace where it's not going to have access to other species, okay? So keeping that in mind, it's like heirloom. It's like the thought, think of like what we think about heirlooms, but on steroids. Heirlooms are passed down and cared for. Land races are passed down and cared for, but they exist in these little pockets of places where they're not going to mix with other species. Okay, so Chimayo. Chimayo is this little town. It had, in 2010, the census stated it had 3,177 people. So small town, little town in northern New Mexico. El Santuario de Chimayo is a small shrine, and that's what we've got in the picture here. It's a small shrine that attracts over 300,000 Catholic pilgrims every year. And before the Spanish arrived, the Pueblo Indians inhabited the Chimayo area since at least the 12th century. The Spaniards arrived around 1540. Well, just to kind of give our historical context of how long people have been in this area. Chimayo is one of I'm sorry, let me back up. The Chimayo pepper is one of several local descendants of the first chilies believed to have been brought to the region by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. So they were isolated, and this is in the mountains here. So they're isolated agriculturally in these rural little pockets where people lived. And these little pockets were pueblos, right? And some of the names of these pueblos, the chilies took the names of the pueblos where they were grown. So you've got the Santo Domingo chili, you've got the Nambe chili, the Cañoncito chili, and Chimayo chili, amongst other ones that are named for the pueblos in the area. So these chilies have long been an important part of people's diets and cuisines of both the local Hispanic and Native American families. Their isolation contributes to the varying and unique flavor profiles. So you can have, you can be in Nambe, which is a small town in Pueblo, and have one of their peppers, the Nambe pepper, and then drive down the road over to Chimayo and have one of their peppers, and it's got a very different flavor profile. Maybe even the thickness of the peppers themselves change, or the shape of the peppers change. It's really interesting looking at all the different peppers, because if you look at the map, the locations aren't really all that far away, but they were able to grow over time, isolated. So of the pack of all of these different chili peppers that are growing in all of these different pueblos in the area, the chimayo is considered by many to be the crown jewel of the chili peppers. In fact, in New Mexico, it fetches over $45 per pound for the powder. But one thing you got to keep in mind, if you're thinking like, oh, I'm going to grow those peppers and make them a lot of money next year, these peppers, or this pepper powder is kind of like champagne versus sparkling wine. Only champagne, for it to be called champagne, it has to come from the Champagne region in France. Otherwise, it's sparkling wine. Same thing with the Chimayo pepper powder. You're only going to get that $45 per pound if it's actually grown in the Chimayo region. So, uh, and I think I got a picture of the peppers here. So here's a picture of the Chimayo pepper. So the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is last year, so in 2020, I think that was when I did it, I was able to find these Chimayo peppers online, and it just so happens that my great and my second great grandmothers hail from Chimayo. And so when I found these peppers, I grew them in my garden and I got to taste them. And it was really meaningful for me to not only grow the peppers, but also taste these peppers because I know, in such a small town, I know that my great grandmother and my second great grandmother grew and cooked with these peppers and fed their families with these peppers. So it was meaningful for me to kind of partake in that. Okay, next I've got, this is a wild story. This is a really wild story. You might have seen some newspaper headlines like this on the left-hand side talking about this, and you might have even seen, this image to go with it, talking about this squash. So this story might ring a bell for you. It was circulating on the internet between like the most, because it's still circulating out there, but it was really hot and heavy in 2015 and 2016. So, as the story goes, there was an archaeological dig. UW-Madison was doing an archaeological dig on the Menominee Reservation, and they found a vessel, a clay vessel, and when they cracked it open, they found some seeds inside, and they did a test on the vessel, and the vessel was 800 years old, and like I said, they cracked it open, found some seeds, grew some seeds, and this squash is what grew from those seeds. So that's not what actually happened. The real story, and I think the real story is more interesting. So it'll be interesting what you think, if you agree with me on the real story is so much richer and better story. I don't know why they decided to not research the real story. So the real story is, it's kind of a mashup of two separate stories. So these squash right here, and I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but the Giti okosomen squash, that's the name of it. These have been grown by the Miami Nation in Indiana for generations on top of generations. In fact, it's estimated that the Miami Nation has been growing these squash and protecting them for as long as 5,000 years. So, and if you know anything about growing squash, you know that you got to be careful when you grow them that they don't cross pollinate with other squashes, because they will do that really, really easily. So they have been very careful to hand pollinate and maintain the purity of the squash for generation on top of generation. The Miami gardeners, Miami Nation gardeners, gifted the seeds to a UW-Madison professor, Dr. David Rohn. Now, here's where, this other crazy story kind of somehow got mixed up in here. He also received seeds from a cave in Kentucky in the 1990s. Somehow along the way, those two stories got mixed up. But I think the story of these seeds being protected and cared for generations is it's a much more exciting and richer story. Okay, so that's all of my seed stories for tonight. Now I just kind of want to talk a little bit about the definitions of heirlooms, open pollinated, what else do I got? Hybrid and GMO. So let's start off with heirloom. So when we say heirloom, there's not, so with the other definitions that I just mentioned, hybrid, open pollinated, GMO, those all have definite definitions. So you can open up a dictionary and Webster Dictionary and Wikipedia, and they're both going to give you, might use different words, but the definition is the same, right? With heirloom, this is a word that there isn't agreed upon definition amongst everybody. Okay, different people have their own ideas of what it means to be an heirloom. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. So generally, when we say heirloom, we're thinking that it's going to be an old cultivar of a plant that's maintained by gardeners and farmers. Oftentimes, it comes from an ethnic minority community in the Western world. From the 16th century all the way up until the early 20th century, our garden crop diversity was huge. There were lots and lots more colors and shapes and sizes when it comes to what we think of as our vegetable garden crops. Since World War II, the agriculture has become industrialized, and mostly consists of food crops that are grown in large monocultural plots. When I say monocultural, all I mean is that this particular plot or field, it will only have one particular crop in it, right? Typically, we see lots of soybean or lots of corn, but it could be just a field full of carrots, right? That's typically how larger industrialized agriculture is done these days. So in order to maximize consistency, fewer varieties of each crop is grown. These varieties are often selected for their productivity and their ability to ripen about the same time while withstanding mechanical picking and cross-country shipping, as well as their tolerance to things like drought and frost and pesticides. So unfortunately, this form of agriculture has led to a 75% drop in crop diversity. We don't see all the different colors and shapes and sizes like we used to. Speaking of that mechanical picking, I want to bring up, remember way back at the beginning of our program this evening, I can get my mouse back. Way back at the beginning of our program when I was talking about our friend here, the Rutgers tomato, and how in 1952, it was like 72% of all commercially grown tomatoes. That was short-lived. It's being the king of the tomatoes didn't last too long. By the time we get into the early 1960s, it's fallen out of favor amongst the commercial growers because mechanical picking becomes in favor, and more farmers are utilizing mechanical picking, and the Rutgers tomato just wasn't tough enough to stand up to that. All right, so back with our heirloom definition. So some folks will define heirloom based off of an age or a date. Some will suggest that the variety must be at least 100 years. Some will go, it's got to be 50 years before we're going to consider it an heirloom. Some folks will say that they'll use, instead of a time period, they use just the date 1951 because that was the year that hybrid varieties were introduced to the market. Um, Another way of defining heirloom, and this is my personal favorite, this is what I like to think of when I think of the word heirloom, is really taking it to the truest sense of the word and thinking about what do you think of when you think of an heirloom, right? And so thinking of it this way, it's going to be a cultivar or a cultivated variety that has been nurtured, selected, and then handed down from one family member to another through generations. Just like you've got, grandma's heirloom doilies, or maybe her fine china. You've also got her heirloom seeds too. On that note, though, most authorities will agree that heirloom varieties must be open pollinated. And so, on that note, let's talk about what does it mean to be open pollinated. So, open pollinated is when pollination happens either by an insect or wind or a bird or some other natural mechanism. So since there's no restrictions on that flow of pollen between individuals, open pollinated plants are going to be more genetically diverse. And this can cause a lot more variation within the plant populations. And that just means that, if I'm growing Cherokee purple and let's say somebody else, say my cousin's growing Cherokee purple. Those are tomatoes, by the way, heirloom tomato varieties. We might be both growing Cherokee purples, and we might notice that one of us has tomatoes that tend to be slightly smaller or slightly more striped, or maybe a little bit, or maybe just a little bit more cracking, a tendency to crack. Those are all different those are all different varieties within genetics. And so when you have open pollinated varieties, you're going to have a better chance of differences in the genetic, even within a cultivated variety. Now, the cool thing about that variation in genetics is it's a lot easier to grow plants and have them slowly adapt to the growing conditions that you're going to be able to provide them. So what that means is over time, let's keep on picking on Cherokee purple. So if I grow Cherokee purple in my garden year after year after year, and I'm saving the very best seeds from the very best tomatoes, over time, the seeds that I save are going to be incredibly well selected for my garden. So when you have open pollinated, you have more opportunities to really create your own strain of vegetable over time. It takes dedication though. So some of the benefits of using open pollinated seeds is kind of what I was just speaking to, that you can save your seeds. Another benefit is it's less expensive, not only for the home grower if you want to save your seeds, but also for the seed houses that are having to grow the seeds and save them every year so that way they can sell them to us, right? Because when it comes to hybrid seeds, you've got to maintain both. You've got to maintain two distinct lines of genetics, where with open pollinated seeds, you only have to maintain one set of genetics. Maintaining that two lines of genetics gets to be more expensive, and you can believe the seed houses are passing on that expense to us, the consumers. And then, of course, flavor. So a lot of people will say that superior flavor comes from those open pollinated varieties. Although it is important to note that there's a lot of new breeding programs out there where the breeders are taking taste into consideration, flavor into consideration, and so they're trying to make sure that they're breeding flavor into those seeds instead of just growing, or instead of just breeding for disease resistance or the ability to ship over long distances. Okay, so hybrids. Um, whew, and I'm going to speed this up because, hey, gotten a little bit chatty this evening and I'm running out of time. So hybrids are, if open pollinated varieties are allowed to cross within the same species, then you can get hybrids. This happens in nature all the time, right? You've got trees and plants that hybridize all the time, and it'll happen with our vegetable crops as well. Hybridization is a controlled method of pollination in which the pollen of two different species or varieties is crossed by human intervention. Hybrids come from the careful and deliberate crossing of two parent varieties, each with traits desired for the offspring. A lot of times what we're looking for is disease resistance. That's often put in there. And that's probably one of the biggest benefits of using hybrid seeds or hybrid cultivars. Let's see. So the reason why is in the easiest way to explain it, it's easier to breed resistance into a hybrid than it is into the open pollinated seeds. And this is going to be really important for both home growers and commercial growers alike. Another benefit would be uniformity. So thinking especially about those market growers, they really need things to be nice and uniform if they're going to want to sell things out on their markets. Another benefit is yield and vigor. So hybrid vigor is a term that was coined by Charles Darwin in the 1880s. And it was used to describe the increase in overall vitality that's found in the offsprings of two parent lines of different genetics. What they find is hybrids just tend to thrive more. You're not going to, if you save those seeds though, they're not going to come true. So if you've got a plant that's a hybrid that grows really great, you try to save those seeds, it's going to look like one of the two parents, but it's not going to be true to the plant that you raised. Okay. So that's something really important to keep in mind. If you want to grow seeds to save them, you can't use hybrid seeds. And oftentimes hybrids end up having sterile seeds anyways too. So that's something else to think about. All right, GMOs. So GMOs are genetically modified. It's an acronym for genetically modified organism. So it refers to a plant or an animal with DNA altered using a variety, one of different types of genetic engineering methods. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that GMO is not a single type of crop. It's not a variety of crop. Think of it instead as a technique. Okay, so a GMO refers to the technique that was used to create it. Sometimes GMOs are equivalently called genetically engineered crops. Transgenic GMOs have DNA from another species inserted into its genetic code. That's going to be something like Roundup Ready corn, right? So Roundup Ready corn, it's got a little bit of a bacteria gene spliced into the corn. That bacteria in nature doesn't care about Roundup or the active ingredient inside of Roundup, just doesn't care. And so when you introduce this gene into corn, you could spray the corn with Roundup and the corn is protected from any of the effects that the Roundup would have if it didn't, which is death. It's protected from death from the Roundup. Other types of GMO techniques include cisgenic GMOs, and these have DNA from a member of the same species. And then there's other techniques. You might have heard of CRISPR. That's a technique that's out there right now. So these techniques either silence or turn off existing genes. So in this picture, just real quick, I just want to share with you the reason why I shared this particular picture. I used to work in a garden center, and when I worked in the garden center, 1 year, I want to say it was 2016, I'm not positive. You may remember orange petunias were out on the market for a very brief period of time, like I don't know, not too long. I want to say maybe 5 years. Don't quote me though. But there were orange petunias. I used to grow these African sunsets. They were beautiful and nice. They weren't like orange, like fire orange. They were more like a kind of a coral orange color to them. They were really pretty though, eye-catching. So what happened was there was a guy, and GMOs are not legal in period. in the European Union. So there was a gentleman that was a geneticist. I don't remember who he worked for, but I believe he was in Denmark, and he's walking inside of his building one day, and he notices inside of the planters these orange petunias, and it makes him wonder, like, I just don't think petunias are supposed to be orange. So he takes some samples, takes them up into the lab, and what do you know? Does some research on them, does some lab work, and he finds that they don't have 100% petunia genes. And in fact, they've got some corn genes in them. What had happened was back in I believe it was the late 1980s, somebody had played around with genetics of corn and genetics of petunias, ended up with these seeds that had a little bit of corn genetics, and nobody remembered that these seeds had some corn genes in them, and continued to breed them until they got these orange petunias and released them out into both the European and the North American markets. So, and the European Union, like, they were immediately, I remember that spring, they were immediately tossed, like, nobody was allowed to keep their orange petunias. In the United States, we are allowed to grow petunias, but they have to go through the USDA or whatever the regulating agency is that handles GMOs. So it wasn't the fact that it was a GMO, but it hadn't gone through the appropriate bureaucratic getting the approvals necessary, because it was technically a GMO and nobody knew that it was a GMO. I don't think from what I read, I don't think the breeders knew either. I think it really was an oversight or an accident on their part, but it did cause quite the stir in the floriculture industry that year. So I remember we at the garden center that I worked at, which was also a seed house, we were told immediately to take them off the shelves. And I also got some information that we were supposed to double bag, not only throw the petunias away, but double bag them to make sure that no seeds escaped. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little thing that happened. All right, well, that's all I have for us this evening. If you don't mind sticking around for a brief moment, I will share a quick demographic poll. And the reason why I asked this information is because not we, there's only one of me tonight, because I work for UW-Madison, and UW-Madison, as an employee of UW-Madison, I'm required by law to show that I'm making all efforts to provide my programming to everybody in my community. And this is reporting demographics of my programs is one of the ways that I do that. On that note, though, none of the answers are, I don't have access to any of the answers, or like who answers what. It's all anonymous. But if you don't feel comfortable sharing this information, I get it. So prefer not to answer is one of the options for each of the answers. So on that note, please feel free to answer the poll questions. I think, yep. And also, if you, I'm gonna let that go for a little bit longer. Also, if anybody has any questions, anything that is clear as mud, anything you wanted me to clarify, go ahead and drop it in the chat. Or if you have any some takeaways, something that was like, whoa, I had no idea, definitely feel free to share too. So Marilyn, do you grow the Beaver Dam peppers? If you're still on and just looking at the chat, was it the Beaver Dam peppers that you grow?
Yes.
So do you agree with, is my description of them ring true for you? Are they kind of sweet at the beginning and then slowly build up the heat?
Yeah, and it's funny because it seems like if I grow them in different areas of the garden, one plant will be hot and the other plant will be milder. So it's always a surprise when you are preparing them, you're really not sure how much heat is going to be in it.
Oh, that's funny. That's kind of like that kind of reminds me of, oh, where is it? Louisiana and Baton Rouge, how they've got the king cake and it's the surprise of who gets the baby. Your peppers are kind of like the baby who gets the surprise of, which one's going to be really
Yep.
spicy.
Yep.
All right. Well, if nobody has any questions for me, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. We'll go ahead and finish up for this evening. I want to take a moment. Thank you, everybody, for spending a little bit of time with me this evening. I hope that you enjoyed the stories. And if you have questions, they pop up later. You've got my email address, so feel free to just shoot me an email too.